I generally think that for most individuals, at least, one of the big missions of the show is to get women lifting, to help them figure out their hormones and sort of lifestyle modifications, nutrition, et cetera. And of course, women are culturally and otherwise just exquisitely sensitive to the number on the scale. And I've often said on the show, it's, when we're thinking about weight loss, it's not like, you don't want to lose muscle weight. You don't want to lose organ weight. You don't want to lose bone weight. You want to lose adipose tissue if that's the goal, right? And one of the things that I find with BMI is it doesn't actually matter. Like BMI doesn't even take into account. So if you put on, let's say, 5 pounds of muscle and you've been training for, 6 months or something, you're arguably a much healthier person than you were, 6 months ago, but your BMI is going to knock you because it's just a total number. They're just looking for weight, right? They're just looking for an increase or decrease in weight. I've heard you talk about the fat-free mass index, and I wondered if you might just expand on that, because for the women who are listening, so my BMI, I did this little experiment just prior to having you on, and I went on to just like an online calculator, and my BMI is 21.8, which puts me in sort of the normal normal category. I did my FFI 18.2 and then
fantastic
normalized. So the normalized FFMI was 19, which puts me in their excellent category. Yeah. Right. So I went from like normal to excellent. So I wondered if you might just you might just talk about the differences between those two and why they're important.
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk about BMI recently, and several health-related bodies around the world have started to essentially jettison BMI because it's just a terrible predictor of health. As for the reasons that you state, it doesn't say what your mass is made up, or as the body mass index, it assumes that all mass is equal in terms of our health, when we absolutely know it isn't. And muscle mass and bone mass are just the critical components, particularly if you want to live a long and healthy life. So the FFMI is the fat-free mass index. It's essentially calculated the same as a BMI, but what you do is you just remove body fat to start with, and you just ignore it, because I think in reality we can do that most of the time if we're focusing on muscle tissue. And there are several ways to do it. You can obviously get a DEXA scan, like bioimpedance, where you sort of like measure the resistance of the body. Like some people, you can stand on those scales or hold those electrodes, and it kind of estimates how much body fat you have. And nowadays, for a single point measure, the bioimpedance measures that they're pretty good. Like they're close enough for you to estimate roughly what your FFMI is. Or you can also, there are even images online where it's kind of like, this is what people look like at certain body fat percentages. And you can say, yeah, that kind of looks like me. And then you can just remove that from your weight and then calculate your FFMI. When we've looked at FFMI and say mortality risk in large population data sets, which I've done a couple of times, the lowest risk for women seems to be somewhere starting around an FFMI of 17. And, the real benefit, it seems to be sort of like 17 to maybe 19 or 20. Like that's the real sweet spot. Below 14 is where risk of mortality really increases. And that's where you've probably got frank sarcopenia. So you've got muscle loss, bone loss. That's associated with that. Yeah. Related to a whole host of chronic conditions. So I think putting the BMI completely aside, if you have some way to track your body composition over time, a DEXA or an MRI is gold standard, but that's tricky for people to do a lot. So even just looking in a mirror, there are also now some apps that are pretty good where you can just like take standardized pictures of yourself and it sort of estimates body fat. I think that's where focusing on moving the FFMI needle with resistance training or other exercise, like that's where you're going to see the most bang for your buck.
And so that 14 is sort of like for women, this is like where we're starting to see maybe moving into maybe like pathologically low levels of muscle mass. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And then do you have a similar, just to be complete, there are, we have lots of women that listen to this, but they also certainly have men in their lives that they love. Do we have the data for men? So it's 14 on the low end, but the sweet spot you said for women is between 17 and 19. What is the homologue for men?
So for men, the sort of the minimum is 17. That's where risk starts to increase. And then the sweet spot seems to be somewhere sort of 19 to 21 or 22.
Okay.
What I will say is that anything above that in the population, sort of in general population data set. So if you have an FMI above 22 or, maybe 23, 24 as a man or 21, 22 as a woman, that's associated with very large BMIs and large waist circumferences. So these are not people who've generated a bunch of muscle mass in the gym. This is just from, a long period of time in a caloric surplus, and some of that is muscle tissue. So what I can't say is that, so I give you kind of that magic range where I think people should try to aim for. If you're above that, I don't think that's necessarily better, but I also don't think it's worse. The problem is we just don't have those data. We don't have long-term follow-up in thousands of people who have high FFMIs in the setting of low body fat percentages, because, that's kind of been that body composition has been a focus of their health and habits. There just aren't that many people like that in those data sets. So that becomes a bit of a gray area, is whether being above that is good or bad. So my FFMI is somewhere between 24 and 25. There's nobody like me in those data sets. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Honestly, I don't. I think it's not a bad thing, but there just aren't good data around that.